lecturing. We were together in New York not too long ago, and of course many visits to Berlin. We were counting last night. I think it's up to at least 7 or 8 in the last year or two alone. So we're really grateful for the steadfast support and dedication also that you have to the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy. The topic that Lord McConnell has chosen is North-South relations and the role of cultural diplomacy in international development. Please join me in a very, very warm welcome for Lord Jack McConnell. Thank you.
Microphone on. Thanks very much, Mark. Mark is always very generous with these introductions to each of the speakers on every occasion. But he always reminds me also of the fact that and many of you will have organised events in your universities or organisations, that if you have to book a really important speaker, you need to book them very far in advance. If you want to have, say, President Clinton come and speak at your event, you need to contact his office, his organisation, about 2 years in advance and make a very strong case for him to come and speak at your particular event. If you want someone like maybe the former Prime Minister of the UK, Tony Blair, you have to book him maybe about a year in advance. Make sure that you have your preparations in place, contact his office, and that signifies just how important he is as a speaker these days across the world. If you want a celebrity like maybe the footballer David Beckham or the singer Annie Lennox to come and talk about humanitarian issues or the situation in the world, you have to book them about 6 months in advance and make sure that you have them date in the diary booked for them. So when Mark contacted me yesterday afternoon in London, I jumped on a plane and came to Berlin again to help him out here this morning. I said last night that I thought cultural diplomacy was a state of mind. I really genuinely believe that. But I also am aware that it can sound a little bit vacuous and woolly as a concept, as a definition. It perhaps doesn't put the meat on the bones. It doesn't give you something you can grasp and take away and work on. It's the phrase state of mind is an approach, but it's not necessarily a solution. So I want today to say a bit about what I mean by that phrase, by that definition, and how it can or should be implemented by politicians, by leaders, by campaigners, by academics, by others throughout the world. Here in Europe, in that part of the world that I particularly want to concentrate on, the Global South, but also in global institutions and where reforms might be required. I had the incredible honour to be part of a quite dramatic, in the UK sense, but very non-violent constitutional change in devolving power to Scotland within the framework of the United Kingdom. But I also had the pleasure to be involved in the margins of the discussions that brought to an end the violent conflict in Northern Ireland. And I've spent a lifetime campaigning against discrimination and injustice and against violence. And I believe that the work of the Institute here, the ideas of cultural diplomacy, the ideas of dialogue alongside diplomacy and development can make a huge difference to transforming our world. And I want to say a little bit about what I think that means in practice, but also about why. We're now more than a decade into the 21st century, and if anything, the events of the last 3 years have just highlighted how divided our world remains. I heard the other day that there are a new set of apartments on sale in London, in the centre of London, for which the starting price is £150 million. Yet today we have still in our world 1 billion people who live on less than £1 a day. We have seen over the last 3 years in particular how the decisions of a relatively small number of financiers, bankers, speculators, and indeed politicians can cause a crisis in global growth and the global economy, while over 1 billion people still live in states that are affected by conflict. And in those states, I think 1/2 of the children in the world who will die before the age of 5 will die in those conflict-affected states. About 1/3 of the women who will die in childbirth in the world will die in those conflict-affected states. And yet the world remains incapable of strategically supporting those states for peace, stability, and development. And we know that in those states, in those conflict-affected states, not one of the Millennium Development Goals will be met in not one of those states. None of those states is on course to meet even one of the Millennium Development Goals. So the divides in our world today between the rich world still remains and the poor world are significant. But our world today is also more complex. It is not as simple as a north-south divide. It's not as simple as a rich-poor divide anymore. There are more significant changes taking place. And I'll come back to that in a second. But I want to start here in Europe. It was interesting to hear the discussion last night, and I think an undertone in the discussion at times about the rise of extreme nationalism in some parts of Western and Northern Europe in particular, but undoubtedly also there in parts of Eastern and Southeastern Europe as well. So the first thing I want to say is that I think the responsibility for cultural diplomacy, for a new attitude to North-South relations and a new attitude to cultural relations lies here in the European continent. This is where the colonial powers were. This is where much of the legacy that still harms large parts of Africa and other parts of the world was begun. It's only 100 years or so since the African continent was divided up by the European powers and then handed out again after the First World War and in the aftermath of 1918. So it is here that we have a responsibility, in my view, to welcome migration as an aspect of globalization. It is impossible to have globalization without having migration. Migration's always taken place anyway. But the kind of individual migration that takes place in today's world is an absolute component of the globalization in communication, in the economy, telecommunications, and culture that we have seen, particularly over the last decade or two. So I think there is an absolute responsibility, particularly on the part of progressive politicians, but I would say on the part of all leaders in Western and Northern Europe, and yes, in the rest of Europe as well, to celebrate diversity, to welcome migration as a contribution, a positive contribution to our societies. The strongest economies in the world, the most vibrant cultures in the world, the most dynamic entrepreneurial societies in the world are those that have welcomed migration, welcomed diversity, and use that as a force within the community for entrepreneurship, dynamism, and success. I think also, though here in Europe, we have an absolute responsibility to move away from concepts of aid and development to the global south that have largely been designed to either secure headlines for politicians here at home or designed to make short-term gains rather than long-term strategic, sustainable gains in the development of the poorer countries of the world, many of which are not poor countries. I'm just back from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where I was observing the elections 2 weeks ago. The DRC is not a poor country. It's a country with the poorest people in the world, but it's not a poor country. And I think it's important that we remember when we talk about the poor countries of the world that many of them are not actually poor countries, but they contain desperately poor people. So I think here in Europe, we need to understand more. We need to listen more, but we also need to lead more at home to ensure that our populations understand the need for those better global relations and understand the importance, the immense contribution that is made by migration and diversity to our societies. But we also need to have a sustainable strategy for supporting development in those parts of the world that suffered partly at our hands, but also still today suffer from extreme poverty and conflict. So the second aspect of what I think, what I want to say today is about what we should be doing there And as I said, it is no longer the case, I don't think, that we have just simply a rich world and a poor world, that simply have a north and a south. Within what might be broadly termed the global south, today we have emerging economies, one of which is now the second strongest economy in the world in China, but also in Brazil, in Mexico, in India, in the smaller countries of the Middle East, and in other parts of the world too. We see emerging economies that are competing with the developed economies, and also making a contribution themselves to assisting others across the global south, and increasingly playing a powerful, influential role in global relations. We have the developing economies, many of which are now on a course of growth. And many countries now across Africa are recording growth levels of 6, 7, 8, 9% a year, improving their agricultural systems, seeing the hopefully sustainable, but certainly in the short term, the end of famine in their country or their region. So those developing countries becoming stronger, particularly those that have been peaceful and stable and have some form of democracy. And then we have the conflict-affected states, that 1 billion people who live in the conflict-affected states, what Paul Collier has called the bottom billion. He has a slightly wider definition than that, but the bottom billion. And I think we need to do two things, in my view, in terms of North-South relations, in understanding that new context in which we are living. We are living in a new context with different kinds of states in the global South. And for those that are emerging, those that are developing, I think we need to harness the skills, the experience, the strength that they now have in their own neighborhoods and globally to ensure that they can play a much more significant role. It is hugely significant that today there are former leaders of African countries and countries in other continents who are making their own contribution inside their own region or their own continent to development, to governance, to improving institutions, to mediation. Thabo Mbeki, for example, the previous president of South Africa, is practically living in Sudan at the moment, constantly involved in mediation to secure some form of stability and progress there. All sorts of other examples of former leaders. I met the former president of Botswana about 18 months ago, and he said that when he retired from his post, he felt a very lonely individual because most former leaders in his part of the world were either dead or in jail. But he said 10 years on, he felt as if he was in the company of many people, and more there were former leaders around who would make that could make that kind of contribution. And that's a growing band of people who I think can make a very real contribution in their own neighborhoods and globally to development and to progress. I think we need to, on the other hand, divert attention, serious, sustained, long-term attention, to that bottom billion, to those conflict-affected states, to those who are living in states that do not have either democratic or stable forms of governments, legitimate independent institutions, and have the most desperate poverty and conditions in the world. The Millennium Development Goals, agreed 11 years ago, do not even mention personal security and conflict. I think the world has changed significantly since then. And as the MDGs are reviewed up to 2015, and the global community sets a new set of targets, a new set of priorities, I would advocate very strongly that we need to have sustained, long-term, culturally appropriate, nationally led, locally driven support, but support in those countries that have been affected by conflict, torn apart by conflict, and are still today suffering from poor governance and extreme poverty as a result. And in all of that, one of the key cultural components, and if we're really serious about cultural diplomacy, we have to be strongly aware of this, is that both in the developing countries, but also particularly in those conflict situations, women are the real drivers of peace and development. And supporting women leaders in those countries, and particularly at the community level, will make a huge and significant difference to our ability to make a sustainable, to make sustainable progress in the longer term. And the reason I mention all of that in the context of cultural diplomacy is I think it was former President Chissano from Mozambique who spoke here earlier this year, who mentioned an old African proverb that we should all speak less and listen just a little bit more. And I think in all of these programs of aid and development, there's been far too much of it has been driven by our priorities, by our desires, our headlines, our debates here in Europe and indeed to some extent in North America. And not enough of it has been driven by the national priorities, by the local direction from the countries most affected. So if cultural diplomacy is to mean something in a practical sense, yes, it is about defense and about conflict and about using all the wider tools of soft power and diplomacy to reduce conflict in our world and improve cultural relations. But it also has to be about how we support the global south in developing to a level where our world is far less unequal than it is today, and doing that in an appropriate context so that the progress that we make is sustainable and not temporary. And finally, the third thing I wanted to say was about the impact of all of this on global institutions. I think, and I've said this here in Berlin before, I think one of the most significant things that's happened in the last 2 years, one of the great revolutions in global governance that has happened as a result of the terrible financial crisis that began back in 2008, has been the creation of the G20. The G8, to me, is an out-of-date institution that has failed. The G8's failed to keep its promises to the poorer countries of the world, the individual countries, mainly, with one or two notable exceptions. But collectively, the G8 failed to keep the promises it's made to the poorer parts of the world. But also it failed in terms of the global governance in leading that drive for the freedom in our economy that led to the financial crisis of 2008 and since. The G20, on the other hand, brings in those new emerging economies and global powers, brings in representatives of the different continents and regions of the world, and creates a forum for global economic governance that isn't perfect, but is a damn sight better than what was there before. So I think we have a model there for other forms of global governance that we need to be looking at on two levels. First of all, in the United Nations, we still have a UN Security Council that is based on not the outcome of the Cold War, not even the existence of the Cold War, but on the outcome of the Second World War here in Europe and Asia and elsewhere. Based on the original 5 nuclear superpowers having a veto, when we know there are many more nuclear powers today, and based on a global system that was in advance of the creation of the European Union, takes no account of the development, for example, of Germany and Japan since then, takes no account of the emergence of new powers, whether that be in Brazil or in Africa or in Turkey, which I know the speaker yesterday from Turkey, increasingly important, influential global power, not just regionally, but in contributing to global affairs as well. So I think reform of the UN Security Council, if we're talking seriously about cultural diplomacy, talking seriously about changing cultural relations, talking seriously about changing global affairs, then reform of that institution should be a priority for progressive politicians and leaders throughout the world. And alongside that, a diversion of some resource, not all resource, but some resource from the, I think it's $5 or $6 billion a year that the UN spends on peacekeeping, and 120,000 peacekeeping troops that the UN now has in the field across the world in missions, not one of which has ever had an exit strategy and come to an end. We still have a UN peacekeeping mission in Cyprus, despite the fact that Cyprus is a member of the European Union. The diversion of some of that resource to peace building, to supporting those conflict-affected states, to build institutions that the people can trust and create development that can build the peace and get a stake in peace rather than a return to conflict. I think that diversion of some resource would make a huge contribution alongside reform of the UN Security Council. And finally, my final point is that the second lesson of the G20 is the importance of regional representation and regional organisation. Right across the world, the European Union model, in some form or another, is now starting to be developed for different purposes. In West Africa, although it's called the ECOWAS, although it's called an economic grouping, in West Africa, the regional grouping has probably done more to diminish conflict in that part of the world than almost any other action over the last 20 years. The eruption that we saw earlier this year in Ivory Coast and Cote d'Ivoire, when the losing candidate, the sitting president, refused to move from office and let the winner take over, was brought to an end by pressure within the regional neighbourhood, saying this is not acceptable, you have to go. That would not have happened 5 years ago or 10 years ago. There would have been a bloody civil war with potentially millions of people killed, both in that country and in the neighbouring countries as well. So the power of the regional neighbourhood to help with conflict, to assist with development, to improve governance and leadership, I think is very, very powerful indeed. And I believe here in the European Union and in North America, Japan and elsewhere where the rich developed world makes a contribution to aid and development elsewhere, the diversion of some resource from aid to individual countries and programs to supporting that regional infrastructure would make a huge difference. And one of the impacts there for cultural diplomacy would be that the interventions would be more culturally appropriate. So rather than Europe trying to help solve problems in Africa, or rather than North Americans trying to solve problems in South America, or other similar interventions elsewhere in the world, some of which much more controversial than that, the building up of regional organizations like the African Union, ASEAN in Southeast Asia, Latin American regional organization, to ensure the neighborhood supports development and helps reduce conflict, I think would be a significant long-term investment for those of us who invest in aid and development. I want to finish with a quote. One of our, some of you may have read the works of Robert Louis Stevenson, one of the great Scottish authors. And Robert Louis Stevenson said that we should not judge each day by the harvest that we reap. We should judge it by the seeds that we plant. And I think if we planted more seeds, then we would see the fruits of cultural diplomacy in more parts of the world. Thank you very much.